The splash echoed too loudly in the unnatural quiet of Iron Hollow. The Elsie flinched the heavy bucket, nearly slipping from her grasp. Icy creek water sloshing over the rim and onto her dusty boots, not from the sound, but from the shadow that fell abruptly over her, sharp and predatory, against the blinding glare of the midday sun. "Careful now, daughter." Saul Ramsay's voice, inches from her ear, was a low rumble, cold as the stones beneath the water. It held no paternal warmth, only the chilling scrape of ownership. Elsie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't sensed him until he was there, towering over her, smelling faintly of stale whiskey and menace. He reached out, not to help, but to run a rough thumb along the edge of her jaw, his touch making her skin crawl. "Wouldn't want to spill the precious water, would we, wasting resources that displeases me?" She swallowed hard, eyes darting towards the murky reflection in the creek. Wide-haunted eyes stared back momentarily, mirroring his cruel possessiveness before the water stilled. A fresh bruise, blooming angry purple near her collarbone, pulsed beneath the thick, suffocating cotton of her high-necked dress. Absurdly warm, a deliberate concealment in the furnace breath of the day. She straightened quickly, avoiding his gaze, the bucket handle biting into her palm as she clutched it tighter. Above on the parched slope, cupped like a miser's hand, hoarding shadows around the town. And the Ramsay cabin perched silent, but silence was deceptive. It was the coiled tension before a strike. Inside waited the echoing void of her mother's absence and the suffocating certainty of Saul's absolute control. "Get back to the cabin now," he commanded, turning abruptly, his boots crunching on the dry earth, leaving her trembling in his wake. The sudden encounter left her breathless, the omnipresent reddish dust seeming to thicken in the air, choking her further downstream. A lone figure drifted along the treacherous, stone-strewn bank, seemingly oblivious Mary Ramsey, nay Albright. Navigated the hazards barefoot, her auburn hair, once waves of firelight, now a tangled, neglected mat, framing a face hauntingly vacant. She clutched a peculiar bundle, dried weeds, a shard of sun-bleached glass, a single raven feather, tied with a scrap of faded blue ribbon, Elsie vaguely remembered from a long-discarded Sunday dress. A tuneless, fractured humming drifted from her lips, a broken melody that grated against the heat-drenched silence, scraping like fingernails on slate. The memory of lavender water, of crisp linen and shared laughter was less than a ghost. It was ash scattered on the wind, replaced now by the arid tang of dust and the deeper, sorrowful scent of a mind irretrievably lost. Mary didn't see Elsie. Her gaze was fixed on phantoms only she perceived. Elsie watched her for an aching moment, the familiar pang of loss inextricably bound to the cold dread that was her constant shadow. There was no help there, only a terrifying living map of what became of those who drew Saul's focused displeasure for too long. Iron Hollow itself conspired in the suffering. The reddish silt, ground finer than powdered blood from the surrounding hills, muted every sound, dulled every color. It coated the leaning skeletons of storefronts, dusted the weary, sun-creased faces of prospectors, clinging to whispers of color in the barren dirt, and settled permanently in the lungs, a gritty sacrament of the land's indifference. Hope wasn't just leached out by the relentless sun that warped timber and bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving glare. It was actively strangled by the hardship etched into every line and shadow. Life was bartered for rot-gut whiskey at the Rusty Spur Saloon, the town's stagnant, beating heart. Survival was the only currency, and curiosity was a luxury none could afford, allowing secrets to fester beneath the dust like deeply buried septic wounds. The Ramsays lived slightly apart, their cabin perched higher where the stunted pines thinned and the wind sang a constant mournful dirge through the rocks, sounding like weeping older folk vaguely remembered Mary Albright, arriving years ago, a flickering candle of fragile civilization intended to illuminate the minds of the town's handful of children. Her laughter, they recalled, was a rare desert bloom, echoing briefly in the cramped, dusty confines of the one-room schoolhouse. Her worn, leather-bound books, the faint, almost forgotten scent of lavender soap, the smile that could coax warmth even from flinty, distrustful hearts. These were ghosts too, now thinner than smoke, arrived alone, didn't she? Hayes the storekeeper sometimes mused aloud, rubbing his chin. Always seemed like she was looking for something, or running from something. A detail often dismissed, but which clung like a burr. Then she married Saul Ramsay, a man who seemed less born and more quarried from the unrelenting landscape itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, granite-faced, taciturn, with eyes like faded denim reflecting nothing but sky. He arrived in Iron Hollow suddenly with few possessions and no discernible past, a man of few words, moderate drink, and an unnerving, predatory stillness. Whispers circulated. Mary had married beneath herself, driven perhaps by sheer loneliness on this desolate edge of the known world. The small wedding felt less like a celebration and more like a collective nervous inhalation before a storm. The light in Mary dimmed insidiously, a lamp wick deliberately twisted lower each passing day. Laughter evaporated, replaced first by quiet duty, then nervous deference, then outright fear. Her walks grew shorter, her gaze dropping from neighbors' faces to the suffocating dust at her feet. Whispers intensified furtive behind cupped hands at Hayes's general store. Arguments sharp and venomous as snakebite drifted down from the cabin on still nights. Sounds like dry branches snapping, followed by stifled, desperate gasps. Then came the marks, bruises attributed to falls on uneven ground burns, blamed on spattering grease from the skillet. The excuses frayed thin as the injuries bloomed, darker appeared, more frequently spoke a truth no one dared acknowledge aloud. The last hint of lavender vanished completely, replaced by the metallic tang of blood, poorly washed away. Elsie's birth should have rekindled a dying flame. Perhaps for a fleeting, fragile instant, it did. Mary poured her dwindling essence into the child, a fierce, almost desperate protectiveness radiating from her increasingly fragile form. But the infant's helpless cries, the constant demands on Mary's attention, and frayed strength seemed only to curdle Saul's simmering temper further. The arguments erupted into brutal storms, the violence undeniable. When Mary stumbled into Hayes's general store one morning, a split lip painting her chin crimson, her eyes vacant pools reflecting only inner chaos, utterly unable to recall the flour and sugar she'd come for. That was the day the schoolhouse door creaked shut for the last time on its rusty hinges. Mary Ramsey, the teacher, ceased to exist. In her place walked the spectral figure Elsie saw by the creek, humming to broken things, shattered glass, fallen birds' nests, eyeless dolls clutched like holy relics. Her voice, once clear melody, dissolved into that low, continuous, tuneless vibration emanating from a place beyond human reach. Some townspeople muttered about childbirth, fever laying her low. Others, recalling the sounds from the cabin, the bruises, the fear that had systematically eclipsed Mary's light, knew better, but clamped their lips shut tighter than vault doors, facing Saul's silent, impenetrable denial. His chillingly calm facade was a far harder prospect than accepting madness as the sole culprit. He'd fetch her sometimes when she wandered too far, his grip on her thin arm, less gentle guidance than assertion of ownership, deflecting concerned inquiries with monosyllabic grunts that were as effective as slammed doors in the face. The truth, like Mary's voice and Saul's origins, lay buried deep beneath the indifferent red dust. But silence in the Ramsay house wasn't peace. It merely signified a shift in victims. As Mary retreated irrevocably into the dense fog of her shattered mind, Saul's suffocating attention, his relentless need for absolute control, began its chilling pivot, like a vulture patiently waiting for one meal to end before settling on the next. It fixed its cold gaze upon their daughter, Elsie, now 12. Elsie was a thin, brittle reed of a girl, her mother's wide eyes holding not vacancy, but a constant, hyper-vigilant fear. The inherent brightness she'd inherited, the quick, curious mind Mary had tried to nurture in brief, happier interludes, was being systematically, deliberately snuffed out. Townsfolk saw less and less of her. No more attempts at makeshift lessons with the kind Widow Harding, no childish laughter echoing by the creek. Only fleeting furtive glimpses. A small figure darting into Hayes's store like a startled rabbit head, bowed whispering requests for salt pork and kerosene answers to questions clipped short. Then came the clothes, even as summer scorched iron hollow with white-hot intensity, turning the air to shimmering glass. Elsie wore thick woolen dresses buttoned tight to her chin, long sleeves fastened securely at the wrists. She'd tug instinctively, habitually at the high collar, a gesture of frantic concealment starkly at odds with the blistering heat that made grown men gasp in the shade. If Widow Harding, her brow furrowed with gentle concern, dared inquire, Elsie would physically shrink, mumbling about feeling a sudden chill, her eyes darting nervously, uncontrollably towards the Ramsay cabin brooding on the hill. A chill in Iron Hollow's furnace air. It was another dissonant note, willfully ignored, filed away with the burgeoning stack of unspoken questions about her mother's tragic decline, and Saul's opaque presence. The word father became venom on the tongue. Mention Saul Ramsay and Elsie would flinch violently, her gaze skittering away like a lizard disappearing into rocks. Fear radiated from her, a palpable, suffocating shroud. She learned to move soundlessly, always listening, watching the shadows, anticipating the sudden blow, the harsh word whispered like poison, and the touch that lingered too long, making her skin crawl and her spirit wither behind the bolted door of the Ramsay cabin. The true nightmare unfolded nightly, a ritual of calculated cruelty. As dusk bled purple and rust across the skeletal hills, painting the dust in colors of old bruises, the heavy bolt would slide home with a decisive thud. Elsie's world would then shrink to the terrifying confines of a dank earthen cellar hidden beneath loose floorboards in the main room. It smelled perpetually of damp soil, rotting potatoes forgotten in sacks, creeping mildew, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of old, ingrained fear. Spiders, lords of the darkness, were her silent, indifferent companions in the oppressive blackness, but Saul rarely left her entirely alone in the physical dark. His favored torment was more insidious, designed to break her spirit from within. He would sit directly above on the cabin floor, his heavy work boots shuffling mere inches from her head, a constant reminder of his looming presence. And he would talk. His voice muffled slightly by the thick wooden planks seeped into the cold, damp air like a poisonous gas, inescapable. He never used her name down there in the cellar. She wasn't Elsie. He called her Mary. My new Mary, he'd croon the words, thick with a grotesque, unholy blend of reverence and menace that turned her stomach to ice. My perfect little Mary, you see the Lord. He realized his mistake with the first one. Flawed, weak, disappointing, always questioning. But you'll learn discipline, you'll learn obedience, you'll be perfect, my good girl, my obedient Mary. He forced her to kneel on the cold, packed earth. Small hands clasped so tight together, the fingernails left bleeding crescents in her palms. He made her recite horrifying parodies of wedding vows, twisting sacred promises of love and partnership into suffocating chains of subservience. He spoke endlessly of wifely duty, absolute obedience, a woman's proper place. Silent, subservient, existing only to please and serve her husband. He hammered it into her fragile psyche relentlessly. She was his. Her broken mother was a discarded vessel beyond repair. And Elsie was chosen, consecrated by him, to take her rightful place. Her voice, a trembling, terrified thread, choked with revulsion and primal fear, had to repeat his poison words back to him. Yes. Husband, the syllables forced out like shards of broken glass tearing her throat. Obey, husband. She obeyed. Because the alternative hung coiled like a dormant rattlesnake on a nail driven into the rough wood by the cellar stairs. The thick leather belt, Its sting was a familiar, searing agony, leaving fiery welts meticulously hidden beneath the high collars and long sleeves, the slightest perceived defiance, a hesitation in her responses. A stifled sob meant more pain. Prolonged torment in the chilling dark silence and submission were her only flimsy, inadequate shields against the storm. Her mother often sitting vacantly in the room, directly above during these nightly terrors, humming her broken tunes, arranging twigs and pebbles into meaningless intricate patterns on the floorboards, offered no sanctuary, no recognition. Mary's faded eyes might flicker towards Elsie as Saul led her towards the hidden cellar entrance. But they held no understanding, no maternal protest, only the vast, empty plains of her fractured mind. Elsie was utterly terrifyingly alone, trapped between the crushing physical weight of the earth below and the poisonous whispers raining down from above, the inescapable dust of Iron Hollow, filling her lungs, tasting perpetually of despair each night, stretched into an eternity etched in cold, oppressive darkness, and the resonant horror of the voice that called her Mary. Days dissolved into weeks, weeks bled into agonizing months, each sunrise bringing only the suffocating certainty of another dusk, another descent into the pit. The rhythm of terror became the grim rhythm of her life, silent chores instinctively avoiding Saul's gaze. The sickening jolt when his hand lingered casually on her shoulder, the chillingly soft, almost tender tone he reserved for his new Mary. The dwindling sacks of flour and beans from Hayes's store, mirroring the growing hollowness inside her soul. Then the inevitable routine and the heavy bolt sliding home, the creak of the hidden hinges, the engulfing darkness, the disembodied voice, the forced vows, the bone-chilling cold. Faint memories of lavender water, sunlight and laughter felt like brittle fragments of a dream, belonging to someone else, entirely someone who had died long ago. Mary continued her wanderings, her strange collections of broken treasures accumulating on the cabin floor. Pieces of rusted metal strands of brightly colored yarn, snagged from somewhere smooth dark stones, arranged in cryptic spirals that shifted daily. She remained adrift on her internal sea, utterly oblivious to the progressive dimming of the light in Elsie's eyes. The careful, pained way her daughter moved to hide fresh bruises, the nightly horror unfolding mere feet beneath her vacant gaze. Elsie watched her sometimes from the cabin window, on the longing for the mother she dimly remembered, a sharp, persistent ache beneath the bitter certainty that she was lost forever across the unbridgeable chasm of madness. The town, wrapped tightly in its dusty shroud of hard-won self-preservation, remained blind, or perhaps more accurately chose blindness, Elsie's increasing withdrawal. Sad naturally, likely grieving her mother's tragic state, the sheer harshness of life in the hollow, taking its toll on the girl, those high collars and long sleeves in the blistering summer heat, peculiar, yes, unsettling even, but far easier not to pry, not to invite trouble from the taciturn man on the hill. Saul Ramsay remained an opaque enigma, his curt nods and impassive rock-like face a fortress effectively guarding monstrous secrets. Iron Hollow buried uncomfortable truths almost as efficiently and with far less ceremony than it buried its dead, than one suffocating, breathless afternoon, when heat waves made the very air quiver above the parched earth, and the buzzards circled with weary, languid patience. Overhead a different presence materialized on the town's desolate edge. He rode a sturdy, paint-marked pony moving with the fluid, balanced grace of one born to the vast, unforgiving landscapes, comfortable in silence and solitude. He was Cheyenne, his name whispered in territories far beyond these eroded hills. Redfeather, a tracker, whose skills were legendary, whose eyes missed little but revealed less. His face was weathered leather, intricately etched by decades of sun and wind. He wasn't prospecting, wasn't looking to settle or trade. He was tracking something entirely unrelated. A stolen horse, a fugitive. A journey that brought him briefly fatefully through this forgotten pocket of dust and quiet desperation. He stopped at the creek, the only source of marginal coolness in the searing landscape to water his weary pony. His movements were economical, deliberate, flowing. It was there, amidst the shimmering heat haze, that he saw Elsie. She approached the creek hesitantly, the heavy bucket dragging in the dust, her head snapping back every few seconds to glance nervously towards the Ramsay cabin looming above. Her small face was a taut, fragile mask, stretched thin over deep anxiety. Red Feather, seemingly engrossed in checking his pony's hooves, observed everything with the keen, practiced eye of a survivor. The unnatural rigidity of her thin shoulders, the way she flinched violently when a raven cried out sharply from a skeletal sun-bleached tree overhead, the stifling thickness of the dress buttoned tight to her chin, despite the suffocating heat. As she bent awkwardly to dip the heavy bucket, the motion pulled the concealing collar slightly askew. Just for a heartbeat, Red Feather saw it. The angry dark bloom of a fresh bruise staining the pale skin just below her jawline. The distinct, undeniable purpled imprint of fingers brutally clamped tight. His dark eyes narrowed fractionally, not with judgment, but with cold assessment. He'd seen the signs countless times before in his solitary journeys across fractured, lawless lands, the casual, hidden brutality settlers often inflicted upon their own kind, the desperation that festered and bred violence, behind closed doors, the subtle, often overlooked markers of profound, hidden suffering. He recognized the scent of pervasive fear as keenly as he recognized the coming of a storm front or the track of a wolf. He watched Elsie struggle back up the dusty, eroded path, her small frame burdened by far more than the weight of the water sloshing in the bucket. He lingered by the creek, letting his pony drink its fill, his gaze sweeping the bleak landscape, the worn, leaning town, the parched, silent hills, the isolated cabin perched like a vulture's nest. An unnerving dissonance hung heavy in the stifling air, thick with unspoken pain and the acrid taste of lies. This place felt fundamentally wrong. As twilight began its slow, inexorable bleed of purple and bruised orange across the western sky, Red Feather made a discreet, smokeless camp well beyond the town limits, nestled amongst ancient, wind-scoured boulders and skeletal juniper trees that clawed at the darkening sky. He built no fire, valuing the cloak of the deepening shadows. From this secluded vantage point, the Ramsay cabin remained visible across the hollow, a weak, solitary flickering eye of lamplight blinking against the encroaching darkness of the slope. He saw Saul emerge briefly onto the porch survey, the surroundings with a grim, possessive air, then retreat back inside. Retreat back. The heavy thud of the cabin door shutting followed seconds later by the distinct metallic scrape of a heavy bolt sliding decisively home, carried unnervingly clearly on the still cooling air. An ordinary domestic sound, perhaps, yet Red Feather felt a cold prickle, a profound disquiet snake down his spine. Hours crawled by under a brittle sliver of moon. The silence deepened. Iron Hollow slept the uneasy, exhausted sleep of the weary and the wary. Red Feather waited patient as the ancient stone he leaned against, melting into the texture of the night. Then a faint sound reached him, barely discernible above the wind's low, mournful sigh through the sparse pines. A rhythmic murmur, almost like a desperate whispered chant, carried brokenly on the night air from the direction of the cabin. He moved instantly, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows, circling with the practiced utter silence of a hunting cat, towards the back of the Ramsay cabin, keeping to the rock-strewn darkness. He found her there, kneeling in the cold dirt beside a low, heavy wooden door, set almost flush with the sloping earth. A cellar entrance crudely constructed, but sturdy. Elsie, in her trembling hands, she held 3 small, misshapen tallow candles she must have secreted away. She was arranging them carefully in a trembling semicircle on the ground before the locked door. She was muttering frantically, words tumbling out in a desperate, terrified whisper, punctuated by choked, stifled sobs, not a child's bedtime prayer. Twisted, corrupted vows, fragments about obedience pleasing him, being good, being Mary. With shaking fingers that betrayed her terror, she lit the wicks. The tiny, fragile flames cast a flickering, inadequate halo against the weathered wood of the door, and the heavy, rust-pitted iron padlock securing it shut from the outside. Red Feather froze perfectly concealed behind a stunted, wind-twisted pine. Mere yards away, the rough bark cool against his shoulder. The uncertain candlelight caught the heartbreaking glisten of fresh tears carving pathways through the dust on her pale cheeks. He heard the word husband whispered again, the single word steeped in a tone of pure, unadulterated, conditioned terror that made his own blood run cold. He watched her press her small forehead momentarily against the cold wood of the cellar door, a gesture of desperate supplication, or perhaps a futile attempt to communicate with whatever darkness lay trapped within. But the padlock was undeniably on the outside. She wasn't praying for someone trapped inside. She was performing a terrified ritual before being imprisoned herself. Heavy footsteps suddenly sounded from within the cabin above. Saul Ramsay's voice, muffled but chillingly distinct, called out sharp with impatience. "Mary, are the preparations complete? Is it time yet, Mary?" Elsie scrambled frantically, awkwardly to her feet, wiping furiously at her eyes with the back of her hand, pinching out the fragile candle flames with trembling fingers, plunging the small space back into near darkness. The cabin's back door creaked open, framing Saul's large, imposing silhouette against the dim, flickering lamplight, spilling from within. "Now," he commanded, his voice flat, utterly devoid of warmth or kindness. Elsie moved towards him like a broken marionette whose strings were pulled taut by an unseen, malevolent hand, her thin shoulders slumped in defeated resignation, the door closed heavily behind them. The metallic click of the bolt being shot home echoed faintly, brutally across the sudden silence. Red Feather remained utterly still, for long minutes, the scene etching itself onto his consciousness with horrifying, sickening clarity, the bruise glimpsed by the creek, the suffocating high collar in the heat, the palpable radiating fear, the locked cellar, the blasphemous whispered vows outside that same locked door, the chilling deliberate use of Mary for the terrified child. It coalesced instantly into a sickening mosaic of profound, calculated depravity, a darkness so potent and insidious, the very wind itself seemed to recoil, holding its breath, in the face of such monstrous reality. He thought of the hollow-eyed woman endlessly wandering the dusty roads, lost in her own twilight. He thought of the silent, terrified child forced to kneel in the dirt and perform rituals of submission. He thought of the man inside, spinning his intricate, poisonous web of control madness and unspeakable cruelty. Red Feather was a man accustomed to moving through the world largely unseen, observing the tangled, often brutal affairs of settlers, without intervention or entanglement. His path was his own, solitary and self-reliant. But this was a violation that screamed against the silent, heavy indifference of the ancient hills, a festering darkness that clawed relentlessly at the edges of his hard-won detachment, echoing the old pain he carried deep within him. He looked at the heavy padlock on the cellar door, glinting malevolently in the sliver of indifferent moonlight. He looked towards the silent cabin, a poisoned boil festering on the bruised landscape. He thought of the child trapped within, not just by weathered wood and packed earth, but by suffocating terror. He needed no sanction from the sleeping, oblivious town below. No consultation with a sheriff who likely saw little beyond the dust on his own worn boots. Some locks demanded breaking. Some prisons cried out for demolition. He moved with swift, silent, predatory grace. From a worn leather pouch at his belt, he drew not a delicate lockpick, but a flat, sturdy piece of hardened steel. A tool honed for brute leverage, not finesse, often used for prying open stubborn crates or loosening wagon wheels. He approached the cellar door, and the faint, acrid scent of extinguished tallow candles and lingering fear sharp in the cold night air. He jammed the sharpened end of the steel pry bar deep into the metal hasp, securing the padlock's heavy loop to the doorframe. Taking a firm, balanced stance, feet planted wide, he threw his weight into it, leveraging the bar against the solid wood. The old wood around the securing screws groaned loudly in protest. He pushed harder, muscles bunching tightly in his arms, and back. A sharp crack echoed slightly louder than he'd intended. He froze instantly, listening intently, every sense straining silence from the cabin, only the sigh of the wind. He applied pressure again, lower this time, finding a weaker point. Another sickening, splintering crack, louder this time, and the entire metal hasp ripped free from the weathered doorframe with a final groan of tortured wood. The heavy padlock dropped uselessly into the soft dust, with a dull, heavy, final thud. Freedom's first sound, he pulled the heavy wooden cellar door upward and propped it open. A gust of cold, damp air, thick with the cloying smell of earth decay. Old potatoes and something sourer, sharper, raw despair, rushed out to meet him. Darkness greeted him, profound and absolute within. Elsie. He called, his voice a low, carrying whisper, careful not to alert anyone inside the main cabin. Arlance. Then a faint, furtive scuffling sound from the farthest corner. He hesitated, only a heartbeat steeling himself, then swung his legs agilely over the threshold and dropped silently onto the packed earth floor several feet below. He stood perfectly immobile for a long moment, allowing his sharp night vision to adjust. Weak, fractured moonlight filtered down through the open doorway above, slowly sketching faint shapes in the Stygian gloom. Hulking, shapeless sacks emitting the odor of rot, shadowy shelves laden with dusty, unidentifiable jars, thick cobwebs draped like ancient funereal shrouds. And huddled in the farthest, darkest corner, almost invisible against the damp earth wall, a small, trembling figure, knees pulled tight to her chest, arms clamped defensively over her head, as if expecting a blow. Elsie. He repeated, his voice gentler now, striving for calm reassurance, but still firm. The figure flinched violently, pressing herself impossibly tighter against the cold, damp earth wall behind her. I am here to help you. You do not belong down here in the dark. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. She scrambled backward with a small, choked, terrified gasp, hitting the wall. No, please. Please, no more tonight. I'll be good. I swear, I'll say them right this time, I promise. Please, husband. The word ripped from her throat, raw and ragged, steeped in years of conditioned terror and utter helplessness. Red Feather stopped immediately, the word hitting him like a physical blow. The sickness, the poison ran far deeper than even this dark, foul cellar. I am not him. Red Feather stated clearly, his voice calm, level, projecting a quiet steadiness he desperately hoped could penetrate the thick wall of her ingrained panic. My name is Red Feather. I saw you outside earlier. I saw the lock on this door. This ends now tonight. No child belongs in chains hidden from the sun. He crouched low, maintaining a respectful distance, careful not to loom over her small, trapped form. Your father's Saul. He cannot keep you here any longer. He cannot hurt you tonight. Listen to me. You are safe now. Slowly, hesitantly fighting against years of learned submission, Elsie lowered her arms, fractionally. Her eyes enormous and starkly dark in the subterranean gloom fixed on him. A desperate maelstrom of ingrained fear warring fiercely with a dawning, bewildered flicker of something utterly unfamiliar. Hope. He'll find me. She whispered, her voice hoarse, cracking her small body, trembling uncontrollably like a leaf in a high wind. He always finds me. He'll use the belt, he'll drag me back down here. He hurts Mama, I can't. Her words trailed off into ragged sobs. He will not hurt you again. Red Feather promised, his voice infused with a quiet, unwavering conviction that seemed finally to penetrate the dense shield of her terror. Not tonight, not ever again, if I can help it. But we must leave this place. Now immediately, before he discovers the lock is broken, before he wakes fully. He extended a hand slowly towards her palm. Open, steady, deliberately, non-threatening. Come with me now, Elsie, come out, into the light. For a long, breathless, eternally stretching moment, Elsie stared mutely at his outstretched hand. The cellar, her nightly prison, and the source of unimaginable terror, was at least a known horror leaving. Freedom, escape. That was a vast, terrifying abyss of unknown's dangers, perhaps even worse. But the stranger's eyes steady and surprisingly clear. In the faint, filtering moonlight, the quiet certainty resonant in his deep voice. They offered a fragile, unexpected lifeline she hadn't dared even dream of, let alone grasp in years. She glanced involuntarily towards the open rectangle, a faint light framing the opening above a small patch of distant, cold, indifferent stars visible against the profound darkness enveloping her. Taking a shaky, ragged breath that tasted painfully of dust decay, and the first raw tendrils of courage, she reached out and placed her small, trembling, ice-cold hand into Red Feather's warm, firm, calloused grasp. He helped her gently to her feet, his touch unexpectedly gentle, yet powerfully supportive. He guided her quickly towards the opening, boosted her up effortlessly with surprising strength, and vaulted out silently, fluidly behind her. He paused only long enough to pull the heavy, broken cellar door shut, leaving the useless, discarded padlock glinting dully in the dirt beside the splintered wood, a small, potent symbol of shattered tyranny lying exposed in the moonlight. He took Elsie's hand again, feeling the small bird-like fragility within his strong, protective grip. Stay close. Utter silence now, he commanded in a low, urgent whisper. They moved like wraiths skirting the weak perimeter of the cabin's faint lamplight, melting instantly into the deeper embracing shadows of the ancient pines and large tumbled boulders littering the steep hillside. As they put crucial distance between themselves and the sleeping cabin, a floorboard creaked loudly inside. A muffled sound followed. Saul stirring perhaps, turning heavily in his sleep, disturbed by some subliminal noise or intuition. Elsie froze instantly, her breath catching in a sharp, strangled gasp of pure terror. Red Feather gave her hand a firm tug, pulling her forward faster now, urging her into the denser cover of the trees. They began to climb. Red Feather setting a relentless ground-eating pace, half carrying Elsie, when exhaustion and primal fear made her young legs tremble violently and falter on the loose scree. He gave her water from his canteen, periodically pressed a piece of dried bison jerky from his pouch into her hand, which she clutched tightly but couldn't bring herself to eat. He spoke little, allowing the rhythmic crunch of their determined footsteps on the dry, unforgiving ground, and the vast, indifferent silence of the moonlit hills to be a temporary fragile balm. Behind them, the Ramsay cabin remained a blot of contained darkness on the slope, completely unaware that its foulest, most protected secret had been brutally wrenched free from its depths and carried away into the final, moonless hours before the false dawn. The night wind sighed mournfully through the pines, carrying the omnipresent scent of dust, the lingering odor of despair, and now the faintest, most tentative, fragile whisper of escape. Just as they reached a ridge offering concealment, a sudden shout echoed from below, and a sharp and furious, "Elsie, Mary!" Saul's voice raw with dawning panic and rage. Lights flared in the cabin window. The back door crashed open. "He knows," Elsie gasped, stumbling. "He's awake." "Faster," Red Feather commanded, pulling her into a treacherous, rocky ravine. Choked with thorny bushes, they scrambled downwards, sliding on loose rock, the sharp branches tearing at their clothes. Behind them, they could hear Saul bellowing, his curses echoing off the canyon walls. Then the sharp, terrifying crack of a rifle shot the bullet, whining harmlessly high overhead, ricocheting off stone somewhere in the darkness. Saul was armed and hunting them. They pushed on relentlessly through the remaining darkness, plunging deeper into the broken, labyrinthine terrain. Red Feather moved with instinctive certainty, choosing paths through narrow washes and dense chaparral designed to confound pursuit and leave minimal trace. Elsie, numb with exhaustion, but propelled by sheer terror and a dawning disbelief that this escape might actually be real, stumbled desperately beside him, her small hand gripping his leather tunic, like a drowning sailor clinging to driftwood in a terrifyingly vast, unknown ocean. The world outside the cellar and the cabin felt alien, dangerously exposed, achingly immense. Thorns ripped at her dress stones, bruised her feet through thin shoes, but fear was a brutal whip, driving her onward. They crossed a shallow, fast-running stream, the icy water shocking them awake, hoping it would mask their trail. As they scrambled up the far bank, lungs burning, Elsie slipped on a patch of wet moss. She cried out as her feet went out from under her, tumbling towards the churning water below. Red Feather reacted instantly, lunging, grabbing her arm with bruising force, hauling her back from the edge just as a shower of dislodged pebbles cascaded into the stream where she would have fallen. She clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably for a moment, the nearness of fresh disaster overwhelming her. "Quiet!" he hissed urgently, scanning the darkness behind them. "We must keep moving. He is close." They hid minutes later, pressed flat behind a cluster of large boulders, as Saul crashed through the undergrowth nearby, cursing fluidly, his heavy breathing audible even over the rush of the stream. He paused, listening, scanning the darkness, rifle held at the ready. Elsie held her breath, convinced he must see them, convinced her pounding heart alone would give them away. He stood silhouetted against the slightly less dark sky for what felt like an eternity, his presence a palpable miasma of frustrated violence. Then, seemingly deciding they'd gone a different way, he moved off, crashing downstream, his angry shouts fading gradually into the distance. Elsie sagged against the cold rock, shaking violently. They climbed again, seeking higher, more rugged ground. Near the crest of another ridge, just as the first tentative gray fingers of dawn began to probe the eastern sky, the ground beneath Elsie's feet shifted ominously. A section of loose scree gave way. With a low rumble, Red Feather shoved her hard, pushing her sideways onto more stable rock, just as a small cascade of stones and earth slid downwards, gathering momentum, dislodging larger rocks in its path, creating a miniature avalanche that crashed noisily into the ravine below. It was a close call. Another brush with injury or worse, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers surrounding them, both human and natural. Finally, as the first true rays of sun painted the highest eastern peaks in hesitant strokes of rose and gold, Red Feather found what he was looking for. A shallow cave mouth well concealed behind a thick, tangled curtain of wild grape vines and a jumble of ancient, weathered rocks. "Here," he said, his voice low and strained. "We rest now. We are hidden." He helped Elsie sink onto the cool stone floor inside the shallow shelter, her legs collapsing beneath her like fragile reeds. She instinctively huddled against the damp rock face, drawing her knees tight to her chest, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar, rugged landscape visible through the vines with wide, exhausted apprehension. Red Feather gathered dry twigs with practiced economical efficiency and coaxed a small, almost smokeless fire to life in the cave mouth, its flickering warmth a small welcome defense against the lingering chill of the high desert morning air. He offered water again from his canteen, and this time Elsie drank deeply, thirstily. He pressed the jerky into her hand once more. "Eat," he urged gently. "You need strength for the journey ahead." She took a small, hesitant bite, chewing mechanically, her gaze lost somewhere in the vast, empty distance, her mind still struggling to process the night's whirlwind of terror and escape. The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of unspoken horrors, punctuated only by the fire's soft, hungry crackle and the mournful sigh of the wind scouring the high, empty ridges outside their fragile sanctuary. Redfeather didn't press. Her didn't pry. He understood the delicate, brittle shell shock of profound trauma and the mind's desperate need for stillness and safety before the painful words could begin to surface. He sat nearby, a calm, unobtrusive sentinel, meticulously sharpening the blade of his skinning knife with a small whetstone, or studying the intricate patterns of animal tracks etched in the fine dust near their shelter. Hours crept slowly by. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, filling the cave mouth with indirect light. Then hesitantly, cautiously, like the first reluctant drops of water thawing from a deeply frozen icicle, Elsie began to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper at first, fragmented, broken, disjointed. Not about the cellar, not directly, not yet. Small, fragile memories surfaced like bubbles rising from deep water. The surprising softness of her mother's cheek before everything changed. The specific sharp scent of pine needles crushed underfoot on a forgotten walk years ago, a walk filled with laughter. The exact way sunlight used to stream through the dusty, warped panes of the long-shut schoolhouse window during story time, shards of a life stolen, rendered impossibly distant by the intervening years of darkness. Redfeather listened intently, his face impassive. Revealing nothing but his dark eyes, held a profound, quiet, weary understanding. He simply nodded occasionally, letting the companionable silence draw the buried words out gently, patiently. Then hesitantly, she asked, her voice barely audible above the fire's crackle. "Why? Why did you help me, Saul? He calls people like you savages, he says." Redfeather stopped sharpening his knife. He looked directly at her, his gaze steady. "Your father speaks from a place of great darkness, Elsie. He sees only shadows because he carries them within him. What I saw a child in chains. I saw fear where there should be safety. That is an imbalance. A wrongness that cries out." He paused, then added, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, weighted with old grief. "Long ago, my own sister, she faced a man cut from the same poisoned cloth as your father, cruel. Controlling his words were whips. His hands were stones. I was younger then, blinded by my own concerns, too slow to see the signs, too late to act. Before her spirit broke entirely. Her light went out because no one, not even her own brother, stepped between her and the darkness." His eyes held a deep, old, unhealed pain. For a long moment, a glimpse into his own guarded history. "When I saw the fear in your eyes by the creek, the mark on your neck, left by his hand, I could not simply ride on and leave you to that fate. Some shadows demand confrontation, some spirits must be set free, or their echoes haunt the living forever." His simple, direct words, raw with unexpected vulnerability and quiet, unshakable conviction, seemed to bypass her ingrained fear and touch something deep, dormant within her. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Her tear-swollen eyes wide, the constant, vigilant terror momentarily receding, replaced by a nascent, hesitant, fragile flicker of trust. His intervention wasn't random charity. It was rooted in a shared, harsh landscape of loss and regret. For the first time since scrambling desperately out of the suffocating darkness of the cellar, a tiny, almost extinguished spark of something other than abject fear ignited within the desolate, ravaged landscape of her young heart. She wasn't entirely alone in the terrifying wilderness. Someone saw her. As the day warmed further and the raw, jagged edge of immediate, life-threatening fear began to recede slightly, replaced by bone-deep weariness and the staggering, almost incomprehensible reality of her escape, the dam inside Elsie finally catastrophically crumbled. Words poured out of her, then tumbling over each other in a wrenching, chaotic torrent of accumulated pain, suffocating shame, and bewildered, terrified grief. She spoke of the coiled leather belt hanging by the stairs, the burning, stinging welts hidden carefully beneath dresses, that felt like suffocating burial shrouds, the constant gnawing acid-like terror that permeated the very air of the cabin, like invisible mold. She described the nightly ritual in horrifying graphic detail, the cloying darkness pressing in the imagined skittering of spiders on her skin, the cold, damp earth biting into her knees, the pervasive smell of mildew rot and stale fear. And the words, the horrible, twisted words Saul forced from her lips, the name he relentlessly branded her with. New Mary, husband, obedient wife. Her voice broke repeatedly, thick with a shame and revulsion so profound it scalded her throat. She confessed her helpless, agonizing guilt regarding her mother, and the humming ghost sitting vacantly nearby, while her daughter knelt shivering in the dark pit below, offering no shield, no comfort, trapped irrevocably in her own impenetrable psychic twilight. Redfeather listened without interruption, his expression unchanging, a mask carved from weathered pine. But his eyes reflected the full, horrifying gravity of her harrowing testimony. He had sensed the presence of darkness in Iron Hollow, smelled the fear, but the meticulous, systematic psychological nature of the cruelty, the chilling, calculated manipulation woven into Saul's monstrous delusion, surpassed even his grim, world-weary assumptions. He heard the crushing weight of years of hidden terror, the deliberate, methodical annihilation of a child's spirit, the monstrous alternate reality Saul had meticulously constructed within the cabin walls and ruthlessly enforced through violence and fear. When Elsie finally fell silent, utterly spent, limp with exhaustion, fresh tears streaming down her dust-streaked face, her thin body trembling violently with the painful aftershocks of her cathartic confession, Redfeather didn't offer empty platitudes or hollow reassurances. He reached out slowly, not to touch her directly, but placed a steadying hand on the cool, solid rock beside her shoulder. "You are brave, Elsie," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with absolute, unwavering certainty. "Far braver than you can possibly comprehend right now. What was done to you, it was a great and profound evil. It was never your fault. None of it, do you understand me, child? The shame, the darkness, it belongs solely to him, not to you, never to you." Meanwhile, back in Iron Hollow, the sun rose with its usual indifferent brutality on another parched, dust-choked day. Saul Ramsay woke later than usual, head thick from poor sleep and simmering unease. He stretched the familiar morning routine, masking the sudden, jarring hollowness where his absolute control normally resided. Something felt off. He ambled towards the back of the cabin, intending to unbolt the cellar door to retrieve his new Mary and set her to her morning duties scrubbing the floors. He stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy metal hasp was ripped violently from the doorframe. Splintered shards of raw wood exposed against the weathered planking. The formidable padlock lay discarded absurdly in the red dust, like a dead, overturned beetle. A frigid dread, cold, sharp, and utterly unfamiliar, pierced through his usual stony impassivity. He wrenched the cellar door open with a roar, bellowing into the empty, mocking darkness below. "Elsie, Mary, get up here this instant." Only the musty silence of the disturbed earth and the faint scuttling of unseen insects answered him, panic raw, primal and suffocating, clawed fiercely at his throat. He scrambled back into the small cabin, searching frantically. Mary was there. Of course, sitting hunched by the cold, dead hearth, meticulously arranging smooth gray pebbles into a new intricate spiral pattern, humming her endless broken tune, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering around her. But Elsie was gone. He burst from the cabin like a maddened bull rifle, forgotten for the moment, scanning the empty, mocking hillsides, his eyes wild with disbelief and rising fury. Gone, the lock broken, deliberately smashed. Someone knew, someone had interfered, someone had taken her, his mind scrambling desperately for purchase. Immediately snagged on the unwelcome image of the outsider from yesterday. The quiet, watchful Cheyenne tracker down by the creek. the way the man had looked at Elsie. Rage hot and volcanic surged through him, completely eclipsing the initial flicker of cold fear. Not concern for Elsie's safety or well-being. Not an ounce of paternal worry, but pure, incandescent fury at the intolerable violation of his absolute domain, and the outrageous theft of his rightful possession, the shattering of his meticulously constructed private reality. He stormed down the dusty hill towards the town, his face a thundercloud of righteous, calculated outrage. He kicked open the bat-wing doors of the Rusty Spurs saloon with explosive force. The sudden violence silencing the few early drinkers nursing their morning rot-gut whiskey. "My daughter!" he roared, slamming a heavy calloused fist down hard onto the rough-hewn wooden bar, making dusty glasses jump and cheap whiskey slosh onto the stained surface. "Elsie abducted, stolen, right from under my own roof in the dead of night." It was him, that damned Indian tracker. The Cheyenne savage I saw lurking down by the creek yesterday like a hungry coyote. He broke my lock, crept into my cellar, and snatched her while we slept. His bellowed accusations riveted the attention of everyone within earshot. Abduction, an Indian tracker. The charged words ignited latent fears and deep-seated simmering prejudices within the isolated, vulnerable community, like sparks hitting dry tinder. Men turned slowly from their drinks, wary eyes narrowing low murmurs rippling through the saloon and spreading quickly to the small crowd already gathering outside on the dusty boardwalk. Sheriff Brody, a portly, slow-moving man whose usual authority extended little further than mediating drunken disputes over card games, hurried over, hastily buckling his gun belt over his ample stomach, his face flushed with alarm. "Hold on now, Saul, easy there. Slow down a minute." Brody puffed, trying vainly to inject a semblance of calm into the rapidly escalating tension. "Abducted. Are you plumb certain sure about that? Could she maybe have just wandered off on her own? You know, like her poor, afflicted ma sometimes does?" Wandered off. Saul spat contemptuously, his eyes blazing with convincing fury and a masterful imitation of paternal anguish. "My cellar lock was smashed clean off the frame, ripped right out. He took her, I tell you. That heathen savage probably halfway to the territories by now with her. God knows what he plans." He painted a vivid, chilling picture, a dark predator creeping in silence, stealing a helpless child from the supposed safety of her home, conveniently omitting the crucial damning detail that her safe place was a cold, damp, locked cellar floor. His performance was chillingly effective, fueled by genuine rage, the white-hot rage of violated ownership and exposed secrets, not protective paternal love. An ugly, volatile current of fear and reactive anger surged through the men gathered in Iron Hollow. An outsider, a Cheyenne tracker, brazenly snatching a white child from the heart of their town. It struck a deep, primal protective nerve. Men instinctively reached for dusty rifles leaning against walls, voices rose in angry speculation and muttered threats fueled by Saul's apparent distraught grief and the ingrained, easily stoked suspicion of anyone perceived as different, anyone not belonging. A posse was forming rapidly, spontaneously, a coalescing wave of reactive fury, seeking an outlet. Sheriff Brody, swept along helplessly by the powerful momentum, looked flustered, but attempted to appear resolute. "All right, now settle down, folks, settle down," he shouted, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "We'll saddle up right now. Saul, you come with us. Show us where you think he might have gone, where you saw tracks, maybe. We'll hunt him down. We'll track that devil down and get your little Elsie back safe and sound. Don't you worry none about that." Saul nodded grimly, masking the dark glint of savage satisfaction flickering deep in his eyes. Yes, they would hunt the tracker. They would punish him severely for his interference, and then they would bring Elsie back to the cabin, back to the cellar, back to her lessons. back under his absolute unquestioned control. But the hunt proved utterly futile, a frustrating exercise in chasing shadows. Red Feather, anticipating exactly this kind of furious, ill-organized pursuit, had deliberately moved Elsie through terrain specifically chosen to confound trackers less skilled and patient than himself. Winding through narrow rock-strewn washes that held no prints, crossing patches of bare, sun-baked rock, doubling back through dense chaparral, leaving a trail too faint, too convoluted, too expertly obscured for the angry, dust-choked townsman to decipher. The posse returned late that sweltering evening, exhausted, thirsty horses, lathered tempers frayed and utterly empty-handed, their initial righteous anger curdling rapidly into frustrated grumbles and the first seeds of muttered doubt. Saul's continued loud, adamant insistence on the tracker's guilt began to sound increasingly hollow, almost desperate, as the hours passed with absolutely no sign of either the girl or her supposed abductor. Why smash a cellar lock specifically? Wouldn't a kidnapper just break a window or force the main door? Why would a lone tracker risk such a brazen, noisy abduction right under the nose of a settled town, when he could have waited and snatched her by the creek unnoticed? The initial, easily inflamed certainty started to fray around the edges, like old rope. It was Widow Harding, her kindly face, etched with deep concern and a growing unease, who dared to voice the first quiet, courageous dissent. She approached Sheriff Brody later that evening as the failed posse dispersed into the dusty twilight, muttering amongst themselves, "Sheriff." She began, her voice low but clear and firm, carrying unexpected weight in the subdued atmosphere. "Something about all this feels deeply wrong, Sheriff. Terribly wrong, that child, little Elsie. I tried to teach her reading for a spell, you remember, after Mary. Well, after Mary wasn't herself anymore. She hasn't been truly right for a long, long time now. Scared spitless, like a little field mouse, constantly cornered by a hawk, and always hiding herself away behind those thick, high-necked dresses, Sheriff. Always even in 100-degree heat, like today. It just wasn't natural. Never felt natural." Hayes, the storekeeper who had been sweeping the dust from his boardwalk nearby, overheard and shuffled closer, nodding grimly, wiping sweat from his brow with a dusty forearm. Aye, the widow speaks truth there. Sheriff, Elsie was like a little ghost the last few times she dared come into the store, head down, hardly speaking above a whisper, hardly buying enough salt pork and flour to keep a starved bird alive. Truth be told, flinched like you'd struck her if you spoke her name too sudden, and always looking back over her shoulder towards that cabin on the hill, like she expected Saul himself to materialize out of thin air. Slowly, cautiously, others joined the hushed, impromptu conversation gathering near the darkening general store. Pooling fragmented, previously dismissed observations, Elsie's extreme withdrawal over the past year. Her whispered, evasive replies, the palpable, almost visible aura of fear that clung to her. Whenever her father's name was mentioned, the unnatural clothing, small details, strange behaviors easily explained away or ignored in isolation, now began to coalesce under the shadow of the failed hunt and Saul's increasingly strident accusations, forming a deeply disturbing, uncomfortable pattern. The focus of the town's collective unease began a subtle but powerful shift away from the unseen, vanished tracker and towards the silent, watchful cabin, perched ominously on the hill towards the taciturn, controlling man who lived within its shadows. Why was Elsie Ramsey apparently being locked in a cellar every night? Saul's hurried defensive explanation. It was for her own protection, Sheriff just trying to stop her wandering off like poor Mary. Suddenly felt terrifyingly thin, practically transparent, rotten clear through. Several uneasy days later, long after the posse's fruitless search had settled into an uneasy, questioning quiet, and Saul had retreated into sullen, resentful silence within his cabin, the definitive turning point arrived, delivered from the most unexpected and tragic source imaginable. Mary Ramsey, on one of her aimless, meandering wanderings, strayed farther than usual from the hollow's familiar boundaries. She was found late in the afternoon by a concerned neighbor, sitting mutely on the warped, sun-bleached, dusty steps of the long-abandoned one-room schoolhouse. A place resonant with the bittersweet echoes of her lost past, her vanished dreams, some deeply buried instinct, some fleeting momentary flicker of a forgotten self struggling toward the light, must have unconsciously drawn her back to this potent symbolic place. In her lap, clutched tightly in oblivious, restless hands, was not her usual collection of broken dolls, dried weeds, or meaningless pebbles, but something far more significant. A small, worn, leather-bound book, its cover softened with age, and handling her journal. The meticulous, heartbreaking record of her arrival in Iron Hollow, brimming with hope, her aspirations for her students, the shy excitement of her courtship with Saul Ramsay, and then, chillingly page by painful page, the harrowing, detailed chronicle of her terrifying descent into suffocating fear, escalating violence, and eventual madness under his relentless, brutal control. Tucked carefully inside the back cover, almost falling out, was a brittle folded piece of paper. A faded letter. Widow Harding, alerted by the neighbor, hurried to the schoolhouse. She gently retrieved the journal and the loose letter from Mary's unresisting childlike fingers. Mary seemed utterly unaware of the transaction, her eyes fixed on the intricate dust patterns her fingertips were tracing endlessly on the decaying wooden steps, her low, tuneless humming, the only sound breaking the heavy afternoon stillness. That evening, under the flickering, uncertain glow of kerosene lamps in the cramped back room of Hayes's general store, a small, grim-faced group gathered. Widow Harding, her face pale but resolved. Sheriff Brody, looking increasingly troubled and weighed down. Hayes, his usual pragmatism replaced by grim foreboding. And a few other respected townsfolk whose initial vague suspicions had now solidified into palpable dread. Widow Harding carefully placed the fragile book and the unfolded letter on the cluttered wooden table, her hands trembling slightly. She began to read aloud from the journal first, her voice steady, initially filled with shared nostalgia, as she recounted Mary Albright's hopeful arrival, then thickening progressively with horror and barely suppressed emotion. The early entries painted a vivid portrait of the vibrant, intelligent young woman. They vaguely, sadly remembered her dedication to her small group of pupils, her ability to find beauty even in the harsh, unforgiving landscape, her nervous excitement about building a future with the quiet, intense man named Saul. Then, insidiously, the shadows began to creep into the careful script. Tentative notes about Saul's surprising possessiveness, his sharp, cutting tongue, his quick, frightening flashes of temper over minor incidents. Hesitant, minimized descriptions of unsettling occurrences. A rough push misinterpreted a slammed door excused away. He seems unduly angry when I linger talking to Mr. Hayes too long at the store about supplies. One early entry read, penned in neat cursive. Then darker entries began to appear, the handwriting growing increasingly cramped, uneven, frantic, clear, stark, undeniable accounts of physical violence, escalating fear, suffocating isolation, and Saul's chilling threats. S struck me hard again today. Read one entry, the ink slightly blurred, smudged perhaps by falling tears, my arm. For letting the stew burn slightly on the stove, I told little Elsie later that I tripped clumsily carrying firewood into the house. Another entry penned months later, scrawled hastily, almost illegibly. The light is gone from my eyes. I see it sometimes when I catch my own reflection in the window pane. He says I provoke him now, merely by existing, that my frightened silence angers him just as much as my words ever did before. Perhaps I truly do. I fear constantly. I fear terribly for Elsie when I am unwell. He watches her too closely. The journal meticulously, terrifyingly mapped the systematic demolition of a vibrant mind and a gentle spirit under the relentless hammer blows of brutal, sustained tyranny. Mary wrote of her consuming terror, her profound helplessness, her growing agonizing inability to protect her beloved daughter. The increasing fragmentation of her own thoughts as reality itself fractured under the unbearable strain. The final entries dissolved chillingly into disjointed looping phrases, incomprehensible symbols, and jagged, meaningless lines, eerily echoing the nonsensical patterns she now traced endlessly, obsessively, in the red dust. A profound, suffocating silence filled the small lamp-lit storeroom when Widow Harding finally gently closed the journal, her face pale as parchment, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Mary Ramsey's own recorded words laid bare the ugly, horrifying truth that Iron Hollow, steeped in its own struggles and deliberate blindness, had collectively willfully ignored. For far too long, Mary wasn't lost tragically to childbirth fever or simple frontier hardship. Saul Ramsay had systematically cruelly beaten and terrorized her into the broken, vacant shell she now inhabited. Shame-thick, bitter, and suffocating, hung heavy and palpable in the stale air. They had all seen the bruises fade, maybe heard the sharp nighttime sounds drifting down the hill on still nights, certainly noted Mary's tragic decline and Elsie's frightened withdrawal, and they had resolutely looked away, minded their own business, buried their heads in the ubiquitous dust. They had allowed this monstrosity to happen through their silence, their inaction. As the crushing weight of this horrific revelation pressed down on the assembled group, further grim news arrived, carried coincidentally by a weary circuit preacher passing through from a small settlement several hard days' ride west. The preacher, seeking lodging and perhaps confirmation of a disturbing story, relayed a message entrusted to him before he left. A lone Cheyenne tracker named Red Feather had recently passed through their community seeking supplies. He had left a young girl whom he identified as Elsie Ramsey of Iron Hollow in the temporary safe care of the preacher's own trusted family. The message stated clearly that the girl was physically unharmed, though severely traumatized, dangerously malnourished, and terrified, and she had finally started to talk. Hesitantly at first, clutching a small doll the preacher's wife had given her then. With gathering painful courage, she had haltingly told the preacher's wife everything about being locked in a dark, cold cellar every single night, about the terrible, unnatural things her father forced her to say and do about being cruelly called Mary, about the heavy leather belt kept coiled near the cellar stairs, about her poor mother's helpless, broken state nearby. The preacher, appalled and deeply disturbed by the child's testimony, felt morally bound to carry word back, immediately seeking confirmation of the girl's identity and urgent guidance on what actions should be taken regarding her father. Just before finishing, the preacher added one more detail. Red Feather had shared the tracker had recognized Saul Ramsey's description. He believed Ramsay was a man previously known as Silas Blackwood, from a territory farther north, a man suspected, though never proven due to lack of witnesses, of causing the accidental death of his first wife after years of similar reported abuse. Before disappearing abruptly, Widow Harding suddenly remembered the letter found tucked in the journal. Her hands shaking, she unfolded the brittle paper again. It was dated years ago, addressed to Mary Albright, Iron Hollow, from a woman signing herself only as a concerned sister from that northern territory. It was a desperate, anonymous warning, pleading with Mary to be careful, hinting darkly at Saul's using the name Blackwood, violent past his controlling nature, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his previous wife's demise. Mary must have received it, read it, perhaps hidden it in fear, and then, as her mind deteriorated, forgotten its significance entirely. Elsie's whispered testimony from afar, now corroborated by the chilling letter and coupled with the heartbreaking, irrefutable evidence of Mary's own journal, painted a portrait of calculated depravity so monstrous it drained the remaining color from every face in the storeroom. Saul Ramsay wasn't just a hard, taciturn man or a strangely grieving husband. He was a monster, a predator cloaked expertly in taciturn frontier respectability. He hadn't just abused his wife. He had methodically tortured her into insanity, and then deliberately, perversely warped his poisonous obsession onto their innocent child, preparing to repeat his deadly cycle. The frantic abduction story was revealed now as a desperate, calculated lie designed solely to retrieve his primary victim and violently silence the one witness who could expose his true nature and potentially his hidden past. Sheriff Brody, his face grim as granite, his usual bluster completely evaporated, replaced by the heavy, inescapable mantle of responsibility and shame, pushed himself slowly, heavily to his feet. He wasn't naturally courageous, nor was he particularly astute. But the sheer, undeniable weight of the accumulated, corroborated truth was utterly overwhelming. A frontier law in these parts was often slow its reach, uncertain justice frequently haphazard. But the raw, awakened, guilty conscience of Iron Hollow, suddenly staring its own complicity square in the face, demanded something more immediate, more elemental, more final. No one voiced the unspoken thought aloud, but the understanding passed instantly between them. Silent, heavy, grim, and absolute justice, long deferred, horrifically earned, and now finally illuminated, needed to be served. Tonight, Sheriff Brody checked the cylinder of his Colt Peacemaker, not from nervous habit this time, but with slow, deliberate, final intent. Widow Harding gently, carefully wrapped Mary's journal and the damning letter together in a piece of clean, folded cloth, tucking it safely away. Haze solemnly dimmed the flickering kerosene lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the grim faces. One by one, they filed silently out of the quiet darkness of the storeroom, into the stark, revealing moonlight bathing the deserted main street. They didn't turn towards their own homes, towards forgetfulness. Others joined them, emerging silently, purposefully from the deep shadows of doorways and alleyways, drawn by the palpable, grim sense of purpose radiating from the initial group, like heat from cooling embers. Wordlessly, Farmer Jensen produced a length of thick, stiff hemp rope from his wagon nearby, its heavy coils casting an ominous, undeniable shadow in the silvery, unforgiving light. Slowly, deliberately, inevitably, the group began to move, as one silent, cohesive entity, up the familiar, dusty rise towards the Ramsay cabin. Their boots crunched softly, rhythmically on the dusty track, the only sound, besides the incessant, mournful sighing of the high desert wind through the skeletal pines. No shouts were uttered, no threats were made. Just a heavy, resolute, terrifying silence, infinitely more menacing than any open display of anger. They stopped together before the closed cabin door, a dark, formidable mass of determined figures, outlined sharply against the faint starlight, filtering weakly through the sparse pine needles overhead. Inside, unbelievably, a single lamp still burned, casting a weak, lonely yellow rectangle of inadequate glow into the worn porch boards. Sheriff Brody stepped forward from the crowd. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. The collective will of the group was armament enough. He raised a calloused fist and knocked heavily on the solid wood door. 3 hard, resonant raps that brutally shattered the tense stillness of the night. The sound wasn't a request for polite entry. It was an indictment, a summons of final judgment delivered. The sound of a community finally belatedly confronting the festering darkness it had harbored, ignored, and implicitly condoned for far too long. Inside the cabin, abruptly, the faint, repetitive, mindless sound of Mary's humming ceased. There was a distinct scraping noise, a wooden chair being pushed back hastily on the rough floorboards. Heavy, familiar footsteps approached the door from within. The metallic snick of the heavy bolt being drawn back echoed unnaturally loud in the sudden, absolute waiting quiet. The cabin door creaked slowly open. Saul Ramsay stood framed uncertainly in the doorway, silhouetted against the meager, flickering lamplight from behind him, his eyes adjusting slowly to the unexpected darkness outside, widened almost imperceptibly at first, then rapidly with dawning horror, as he took in the chilling assembly confronting him. The silent, packed crowd of familiar faces turned alien in the moonlight, the grim set jaws, the unwavering gazes, Sheriff Brody, standing firm and implacable at the forefront, and the heavy coiled rope held loosely but purposefully in Farmer Jensen's weathered, capable hands. He opened his mouth perhaps instinctively to bluster, perhaps to demand answers, perhaps to threaten repercussions. But no sound emerged, his throat suddenly dry, as the surrounding dust in that single frozen, eternal moment, illuminated by the cold moon and the colder eyes upon him. Saul Ramsay saw not just Brody and his neighbors, but the collective unveiled, inescapable judgment of Iron Hollow. Stark, unforgiving, silent, and absolute. He saw with sickening finality the abrupt, violent end of his hidden reign of terror, the catastrophic crumbling of his monstrous, carefully constructed facade. No words were spoken by the crowd. None were necessary. The judgment was rendered, the sentence passed in the communal silence. The crowd surged forward like a single dark, silent wave, engulfing him instantly, pulling him forcibly out into the cold night air, away from the feeble light. The cabin door slammed shut behind them with a violent, echoing finality, plunging the interior back into shadow, leaving only Mary Ramsey inside, perhaps resuming her broken humming, perhaps tracing new patterns in the hearth ashes, alone with her ghosts and tangled memories, oblivious or perhaps blessedly unaware of the raw, swift, terrible justice being enacted just outside her door, beneath the vast, indifferent, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. The ubiquitous reddish dust of Iron Hollow, which had patiently veiled so much suffering and complicity for so long, would soon settle gently over one last, grim, necessary secret. But perhaps, just perhaps, as dawn eventually broke clean and sharp over the eastern ridges, a different kind of wind would sweep through the parched, wounded hills. A cleaner wind, carrying away the long, stale scent of fear, complicity, and buried truth. Miles away, safe for now, under Red Feather's quiet, watchful protection, Elsie Ramsey would take the first, hesitant, profoundly painful steps towards reclaiming not just her stolen childhood, but her very name and her own uncertain future. Feeling the hesitant warmth of the rising sun on her face for the first time. As a truly free soul, back in Iron Hollow in the difficult days to come, Widow Harding would begin the arduous, uncertain task of caring for Mary. Finding a small, faded blue ribbon clutched tightly protectively in her hand, a fragile, poignant link to a past almost entirely erased. Plans would be quietly made to move Mary to a facility in a neighboring town, a place with gardens where perhaps, just perhaps, the sight of a living flower might someday pierce the fog, even fleetingly. For the town itself, the reckoning was brutal, the confrontation ugly, the guilt heavy. But the suffocating silence finally was broken, shattered irrevocably, replaced by the uncomfortable, inescapable weight of confronted truth. And the stark, enduring consequence of looking away for too long, the long, dark, suffocating night of Iron Hollow was finally truly over.